How's it going, everybody? I hadn't did a video in a minute. I want to do thanks for watching the channel. My name is Mark, and I call my channel Mark's Music Place, and talk about different things: music, recording gear, software, the industry, you name it. Now, I've been really busy, so I don't really get a chance to make these videos as much as possible. But today's topic is, of course, if you like, please subscribe, share the video. You're going to definitely have to hit the bell if you want to be notified. Let's hope that YouTube/Google is notifying people when I post these videos. Definitely write some comments and things like that. Thumbs up definitely helps. It all helps the channel. Doesn't cost anything. It's free. Now, with that being said, I wanted to do a topic. This is going to be like digital versus analog / software versus hardware type of video. And I'm going to give my thoughts on it, and then you can give your thoughts on it. So what I have here is actually I got a couple of digital mixers and an analog mixer. And I'm going to talk about my opinion of the pros and cons of either one. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about so, without being said, so you can see what I'm talking about, I'm gonna take the camera off the stand. Everyone knows about that I have this this Behringer analog console, and what this Behringer analog console has is on the back. This is what we're going to focus on, because we're not going to really focus on the channels so much as we're going to talk about inputs and outputs. Each channel, for example, in this particular console has 24 mic inputs, which means that there's 24 microphone preamps. There are also line inputs per channel, and there are also, in this particular console, inserts per 24 inserts, and there are also 24 direct outs. Okay. Now, also in this console, there are also six auxiliary returns. There are also 6 auxiliary sends. There are also outputs for a control room, a main speakers, studio room output, and there's also additional headphone outputs and stuff like that. There are also bus return inputs as well. And on the back of this console, there are also inputs and outputs on the back for inserting gear, bus outputs, a second set of 24 inputs on the back as well. So you can see there is a lot of input and output, what we call I/O, input output routing. Okay, now this is an older digital mixer right here. This is the Yamaha O1V. It's an older one, but it's a digital mixer, and it's the only digital mixer I have that's a hard particular fader type, where I can hit different buttons and the faders move and react to according to what I'm doing. But we're gonna. It doesn't. All it mainly have is just 20. It has 12 microphone inputs, or 12 line inputs. There's a few outputs, a couple of monitor outputs, and that's about it. Other than that, everything's controlled through the control functions here through the menu. As with most digital mixers, usually you have to control it using a master control set of buttons on most digital mixers. There are newer mixers that have a lot more control. Now, I got one more mixer. This is the Behringer XR12 digital mixer that I have in the rack. It's in the rack here, down here at the rack, and it's a digital mixer. And this is it's remotely controlled by software. Excuse the glare, but that is basically the mixer, and you have different screens I can go to, such as channel screen, the input screen based on the channel I'm on, the gate channel, the EQ channel, the compressor channel, all my sends and routings, my master output on that channel, effects, and then of course metering. And of course there's other functions such as bus, you can set up buses, effects, and there's just different tools, different pages to control the software. So with that being said, this is another type of digital mixer. Now I'm going to put the camera back on the stand and talk about my opinion of the pros and cons of digital mixers versus analog versus software versus hardware. I think, in my opinion, when it comes to whether you're going to have an analog console, I think really your biggest advantage to an analog console, for the most part, is its capability to incorporate a lot more of analog gear, meaning compressors, gates, things like that. In other words, if I pull this back off the stand, in case you're not familiar, I got a preamp here, some compressors, about 4 compressors, a couple of it's a BB Sonic maximizer, some reverb units and things like that in rack. And I can actually set up a patch bay system, and this console has the capability you can run a patch bay with something like this patch bay here. I can have this patch bay, and these are actually, these are 16, but I can have 24 or whatever, and I can have 8, 9, 10 rows of these, and I can actually chain a ton of outboard. I can have 8, 9 racks of analog gear. And of course this room would be really, really tight in this room, but the concept is I can have a ton of rack gear, a lot of rack gear. And all I would do is I would route everything through the patch bay, then the patch bay would be routed into the console, as well as, and all my inserts, my direct outs, my bus outs, all that would go to a patch bay, and I can insert as much outboard gear that I can build through a patch bay system, and build multiple patch bays, and you can have a ton of it. And what's nice thing about the console is not limited to how you build your patch bay. It's only limited to how many inputs and outputs, and this got a lot of outputs. The digital mixers in most cases most of them, even to this day, don't have a lot of input and outputs. Some digital mixers, they have a few more auxiliary outs and ins, and they might have a couple of inserts for the most part, but that's about it. Most of them don't really have a lot of inserts, like having 24 inserts, 24 direct outs. Most digital mixers don't even have direct outs. And you might ask yourself, well, why don't they have direct outs like an analog console? Because most digital mixers today, modern digital mixers, the outputs, the purpose of the direct out on your console is to directly record direct out from the console. It would have went into a tape machine. Well, the digital mixer doesn't do that. Most digital mixers there would actually send the output through a USB, maybe a Thunderbolt or whatever. It could be Ethernet, AES or whatever. Most of the time they're going to talk through this sort of port system. But most of the time it's going to be USB that's going to run into your computer, your DAW. All signals on all the channels are going to go through the USB into the computer, because your computer is now your recording source. So there's no need to have 24 or 48 direct out cables anymore on the digital side. You might necessarily need that on the analog, because the analog, you have 24 direct outs if you got that many inputs. Most of the time, one of the best purposes for having a console with a lot of channels is because you might want to multi-track. Some people will want the analog console, and then they'll have an interface with that many inputs to record a band because they want to get the analog sound. Other people will use a digital mixer because they don't mind having the digital mixer and using the digital mixer and just routing it through the USB, and you're going to multi-track through the USB. So it's preference more than it's preference more than anything else. Now, the disadvantages to analog is that it's because it's analog, especially something like this. There's no sophisticated computer and complicated routing and setup pages like you would have in digital mixers. Digital mixers, you got to go through utility pages, you got to go through setup pages, and you got to manually set up routing. If you're going to do internal routing, or you're going to do connect to an external stage box, that can become a little confusing. And then on top of that, with analog, with the good advantage for the analog is that there are EQs on each channel. But most of the time, most analog will have auxiliary outputs. They're going to definitely have your pan, your solo, your mute, your basic functions per channel. But in a digital mixer, you usually have to select that channel, and then you have to work within the control buttons that control that channel. And it could be within the screen on an external mixer, or that remote software type of digital mixer. Most of the time you have to select that channel, and then you do all your stuff. And a lot of times the only way, it's hard to really see what channel you're working with and see all those parameters such as gates, reverbs, and things like that, compressors and things like that, unless the channel's selected, including the main output. But on an analog console, you can visually see what's going on every channel based on looking at the EQ setting and so forth, the metering and so forth, for most part. But a lot of times what engineers would do with the analog consoles and rack gear, they would mark everything. They would mark the console, and they would mark the outboard gear, and they would let you know, I'm going to use this compressor for kick, and kick is on kick 1, so you know that that's going to be an insert on kick 1. You have to physically. And there are usually some of the other disadvantages of the digital mixers would be that there is no inserts to use external gear for most cases, because they figure that you're going to use the onboard gates and compressors onboard inside the software. Some digital mixers actually have plug-in type of alternatives to basically to the default compressor and the default gates and stuff like that, default reverbs, delays. Some digital mixers allow you to use, they'll have a hard drive of external plugins that allow you to do that. So, but some mixer engineers are like, well, I don't want to use plugins, I want to use real outboard gear. So that can be the limitation to digital. So it's kind of like, well, what would be, so in scratching my back, so with the wall here, so the advantage would be to say, well, what would be the overall advantage? You can, and more than, being that this is an older digital mixer, you still would have to route and use it to a audio interface to record to your software. Newer digital mixers, they have USB where you can plug directly in for that digital mixer into, and it becomes an audio interface. PCs, most of the time you have to download drivers and then set it up in your DAW and all that other stuff for it to work. Macs, most of the time, automatically sees it and sets it up. But other times when using an analog console like I do with this Behringer, I have to run for this Behringer. The outputs of the Behringer goes into the input of the interface, and the input then it goes into the audio interface. It goes into the computer. Some people might consider that might be a little redundant or overkill, especially if you already have a digital mixer like a Behringer X32 or a Midas M32 or a Yamaha TF5 or the Allen and Heath QU32 or whatever. You might have a digital mixer that already has USB, which means it can be act as an audio interface, and on top of that, you might even have it to work as a DAW controller, so you can control the faders and control parameters on the digital mixer, which will control the DAW and plugins. Then they also sell DAW controllers, separate DAW controllers, but it's all about how do you want your workflow. So to sum up the video, to finish up the video, what I would say is this. If you plan on knowing that eventually you're just going to have a lot of outboard gear. Let's say you're going to have, I don't care if you buy the most expensive outboard gear on the market, and that we're talking Universal Audio, Teletronics, TubeTech, Oversteer, Channel Limited, whatever. I'm talking about units that are $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a piece. Or you're going to buy alternative gear that might be lower priced, like the ART, Clark Technic, Behringer, whatever. Alesis or whatever, DBXs or whatever. But you know that you're gonna use a lot of outboard gear because you want outboard gear. You want to use the sound of the circuits of that outboard gear. You would benefit a lot better having an analog console because of the input and output routing. There's a lot more input and output routing flexibility with an analog console. Analog consoles never need updating. They never need software updates or firmware updates. Digital mixers do. In most cases, there are digital mixers that you have to connect and do a firmware update to your digital mixer. So with the analog and outboard gear and all, it's just a matter of getting yourself a separate audio interface. Doesn't matter if it's something like this Behringer Firepower 16.5 here. You can have an audio, an Audient. You can have a Focusrite. Doesn't matter, whatever audio interface of your choice. And you route all your stuff from the interface into for your mixer, your analog mixer, to your interface that go into your DAW. No biggie. It's just one extra component, but it definitely, you're going to have analog sound. That goes into your DAW, then you send your outputs out of your interface back into the mixer for monitoring. And so you can do no low latency monitoring for recording and no low latency recording for playback. So that's the advantage of that. Digital mixers, everything's done through the digital mixer, including sending data into the computer. So a lot of times the newer digital mixers, you can bypass an audio interface. But they are limited to their ability to use a lot of outboard gear because most digital mixers just don't have inserts. They don't think that most digital mixers, they don't think you would benefit with using a lot of outboard gear. And they figure, well, if you want to use outboard gear, why not just use the internal processing like gates, compressors? Maybe we'll load you up with some of our plugins, and you might not want to use their plugins. You might want to use real outboard gear. It's all choice. So you have to think about what's an advantage. What is the advantage? Obviously, for example, my digital mixer here is a lot smaller than if you're looking for convenience of size and you need something smaller, the digital mixer might work. So it's kind of like, what's the best option? Now, when it comes to hardware versus software, let me check my time. I'm about done. When it comes to hardware versus software, honestly, I look at whether it's a hardware whether it's a hardware EQ or software EQ. I just look at them as just choices of gear. I don't think one's necessarily going to be better than the other. Most of the time, the software, they'll build in functions that the hardware unit might not have because it's all coding and you can build in functions by building code to give it functions. And that's what a lot of plugins do. They give you a lot more options. But before 10, 20 years ago, it was a tremendous difference because the software just didn't sound as good as the analog. But now that we're running 64-bit systems, the computers are better. They're better at processing. They are better at they're modeled better. They sound better. They're a lot closer. The plug-in systems, plugins, which is outboard gear, and software are miles ahead of what it used to be. Just like interfaces are miles ahead. Most modern interfaces today sound better than analog gear 30 years ago. It does. It's just, it does. So it's just a matter of, I don't think software, I think that both have pros and cons. The only really con to hardware is you're limited to that one piece. Software can be duplicated. It's all based on how powerful your computer can process. And most software you can duplicate. You can duplicate probably 50 EQs versus having one real EQ unit. In software, you can have 50 of them, just insert it. It's just a matter of how can a computer process and handle it. They're making computers better and better and better that they can now. They couldn't do that before. So it's a matter of saying, well, I should buy a digital mixer, use the plugins. And then usually most of the only really advantages to having digital mixers and analog mixers in the first place is to have more inputs for multi-tracking. But if overall, if you don't, you really don't need mixers if you're only going to do one track at a time, and that's how you do it. You really can just record directly into your interface. Now I want to do another video on types of outboard gear, and the pricing and what, that's what I'm gonna do next. But I know it's going on 30 minutes, but that's my take on digital and versus analog, pros and cons. I would like to hear people's comments on that as well. What would you prefer? An analog console so you can use a lot more outboard gear, or a digital mixer and use the processing and use plugins and just use strictly plugins within the software? No system's better than the other. Just one works one way, another system works another way. So I want to hear people's opinion on that. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a great one.